Good morning, everyone. Hope that everything is okay on this Wednesday morning. I have one quick thing before I begin today's topic. Just want to remind you that your midterm is due next Friday, so Friday of next week at midnight. All the details, of course, are on the assignment page on your Canvas account. If you have any questions about that, you need any help, then feel free to come and talk to me. I am waiting for you in office hours, and I'm also available via email, of course. So if you need any help with that, feel free to do it. Today, we'll keep talking about the economic aspects of IR, of course. Quickly, on Monday, I talked about the role that the government plays in the global economy. Of course, mostly talking about things such as regulating and controlling the exchange of products and capital across countries. How much does a country promote free trade versus protection policies? All of that was led to the discussion a little bit about economics background to understand the idea of comparative advantages, how that leads to the benefits of global trade, such as higher income, higher wages for members of society, the potential to invest and to purchase more types of products. Then we also talk about the cost of global trade, primarily the difficulties to equally distribute the benefits of those global trade across all members of society and what that leads to. We talked about the research by Lee and Reuveni, which showed the problem of the benefits, especially in terms of the benefits in the short term, the difficulties with that. And then I talked a little bit more about actually measuring the public views of international free trade policies and the concept of sociotropic preferences, which showed primarily that public views of complex issues such as international economic policy are not determined by their economic well-being, not by my individual benefits from trade, but my views about how trade affects how trade looks in the entire economic area, and how does the United States, for example, is affected, and what is the current economic condition in the United States. That's going to shape my attitudes much more than my own personal state. So that's one of the important findings of our discussion on Monday. Okay, so if you have any questions about that, of course, you are more than welcome to come and talk to me. And reminding you again that this is still one of the topics that you can use for your midterm. So if you're interested in that, you can also hear, of course, today's lecture and then decide what you want to do. So on Monday, I focused a lot about the foundations of the global political economy. And today I want to shift and talk more about the policy aspect of this topic and discuss two of the main tools of economic international statecraft, which are sanctions and foreign aid. So we'll talk first about sanctions. What are sanctions in general? This is a coercive type policy which is intended to compel the target, the one that we levy the sanction on. We compel the target to accept some demand. Now, a sanctions policy can end in success when the target gives in, or it can end as a failure when the sender states, if I was the one who placed the sanction, I relent and I decide to remove the sanction. That's a failure of the policy. The focus of our discussion today will be about the different conditions and the factors that affect the success and failures of sanction policy. And for our purposes, we're talking mostly about economic sanctions, because sanctions do not have to be economics all the time. But economic sanctions are a set of coercive policy actions that apply economic pressure by limiting the target state's economic activity, and overall is intended to induce a change in the political behavior. And this is an important aspect which I'll keep talking about today. And this is this link between using an economic tool in order to induce a political outcome, a political effect. But we'll talk about it more throughout the lecture today. So a little bit about the background. The origins of the policy is mostly the warfare tactic of siege, in which an attacker hoped to close off a city, a walled city, to such an extent that the citizens inside that walled city would be starved into submission. So putting enough pressure on the citizens within the city that they will accept the demand of the attacker. This tool has been prevalent since the establishment of the League of Nations following World War I, And the most extended use of that has been after the end of the Cold War. As an example, this is data from the Department of Treasury as well as the Department of Defense, of the State Department, about US sanctions throughout the globe as of July 2019. We can see here we have sanctions on Russia, some countries in the wider Middle East, Iran, Iraq, Syria, countries in Africa, including Libya and Sudan, as well as countries in Latin America and South America. So it's a pretty common tool used by the United States, as an example, but not just the United States. Now, in terms of the logic of using sanctions, when sanctions is intended to create an economic deprivation that limits how much the public in the target state is willing to withstand. Once this limit for the public does not willing to withstand this pressure anymore, that should lead to a political disintegration, to a political pressure. A similar example in the context of international conflict, which we can think about, is using aerial bombing strategy. The attacker will keep attacking and sending those aerial attacks until the target state is going to accept its demand. That's the idea behind it, the same thing. Now, the mechanism that is the basics of using economic sanction is rather simple. That is imposing economic cost on the population of the target state and putting enough pressure on them so eventually they will apply this political pressure on their own government to alter its behavior. So the sender state, the states that levied the sanction, disagreed with some policy that the target state is implementing. In order to lead that target state to change its behavior, we're putting pressure on members of the population of that country so they will pay the economic cost of that, and therefore they will put pressure to induce a political change. And once again, this is the most critical aspect of it. Economic cost from sanction must be translated to political ones, or a change is unlikely to be successful, unlikely to happen. In order to effect change, sanctions must be politically costly relative to the issue at stake between the target and the sender. So whatever the issue is between the target side, between me, I'm the country that levied the sanctions, and my rival, it has to be costly enough for both of us that the sanction is going to be useful. In addition, the target government must also sufficiently value the potential benefits that they will gain by changing their behavior and complying with my demand. So if for my rival to change its behavior, accept my demand, they should gain some benefits for it other than just the removal of sanctions. So this is the most important aspect of understanding what economic sanctions are. This link between imposing economic costs in order to generate political implications. So as an example, you have here a nice visualization showing the potential economic cost that Russia will suffer. That was a couple of years ago when they took control of the Crimea Peninsula in Ukraine. And we can see here the potential loss in revenue from stock value of Russia's key companies listed in the Moscow exchange, and loss in trade. There is a loss in individual assets in Western banks, and all kinds of losses which accumulate together to over $200 billion. Now, these economic costs has to be translated to political pressure on the Russian government to alter its policy, in this case, to remove its forces from Ukraine. That was the idea behind that. Now, despite this extended use, a lot of scholars are skeptical about the effectiveness of sanctions. Some plainly argue that it just does not work. One of the important aspects of successful sanction is that the target state will be vulnerable to economic coercion. So despite the relative intuitive logic of using sanctions, it is in many cases criticized from both political and economic standpoint because the target, the country that we place the sanctions on, is more likely to adapt to the situation And for example, if we levy some economic sanctions that are intended to restrict its ability to trade with us or for other countries, then this country can find other trade partners or extend its trade relations with other countries. So for example, what you have here on your screen is the extent of Iranian export of oil to some of its partners in this case before the sanctions in 2015, during the sanctions, and after. We can see here that during the sanction, which is the green bar, the sanctions were levied by the United States and the EU. There was a substantial to actually no export of oil to the EU. But with other countries, China, we are focusing, of course, again on the yellow bars, was still able to trade with those countries. So Iran, was still able to generate enough compensation. So the economic cost that they have because they lost their business with the EU was not powerful enough to make a clear political effect. So this is part of the problem with sanction. So based on those evidence and what we have here, one way to view sanction is a bargaining tool in which each side will behave according to a rational cost-benefit assessment, right? So it's just a simple rational choice. When we view that from the strategic interaction standpoint, so sanctions are a policy which is different than conflict or wars because sanctions can end when only one side of the interaction agrees to change its behavior. In wars, both sides have to agree to any kind of settlement and to stop their behavior in order for the wars to persist. In the case of sanctions, it's not the same because sanctions will not end due to economic pressure. They will end because of a choice to alter the behavior by one of the actors in this interaction. This can be the target. The target gave up, change its behavior, so economic sanctions are over. Another option is that the sender state will relent and will say it's no longer useful for us to place sanctions on country X, so we will stop that. So it's a change in behavior. And for each one of those sides of that interaction, that change in behavior will happen after some time when at least one party in that interaction will prefer to settle the issue than keep paying the cost of this economic dispute. All right, one of the important factors in shaping the outcomes of economic sanctions is the internal political dynamic. So in that case, the domestic institutions in both the target country as well as the sender country. But I want to focus on the factor of the effect of domestic support for the leader in the target state and how that's going to change, is going to affect that leader's behavior facing economic sanctions. To do that, we'll stop for a minute and talk about a theory called selectorate theory. Selectorate theory focuses on one of its most basic assumptions is that leaders' number one objective, and I've mentioned that in the past, is to survive in office. The number one objective that every political leader has is to secure her own position. Otherwise, she cannot do anything. So that's the beginning of that. Now, according to selectorate theories, leaders will try to secure their position by providing benefits to members of their population, what's called in the theory, it's called the electorate. And now the leaders do not have to provide benefits to all members of their electorate, of their population, just to a group which is more likely to secure their position. So the leaders do not have to provide benefits to all members of the public. They just have to provide enough benefits to a group large enough within its potential supporters so that group will keep supporting the leader and the leader will be able to survive in office. And now what types of goods are we talking about here? We're talking about what's called private goods or public goods. I've mentioned that on Monday as well. Public goods are distributed to all members of society. For example, national security is a public good. A private good is provided to a smaller number of people that are closer to the leader. And again, both of those types are mostly intended to secure, and that's another concept within selectorate theory called the winning coalition. The winning coalition is the group within the public or within the electorate, in the terminology of selectorate theory, that's going to ensure that the leader can survive in office. If I'm the leader and I'm able to ensure that my winning coalition is large enough, enough people will support me that I can remain in office. One of the important points that is being discussed by selector theory is the differences between a democracy and a non-democracy, and how that relates to those concepts of winning coalition and providing public or private goods. So according to that theory, democratic countries usually have larger coalitions. What exactly does that mean? The number of members of the public that the leader in a democratic country has to secure their support is very, very large, right? Whatever it is, the results of the elections that took place in the United States a couple of months ago, both candidates has to secure a large enough members of the public in order to either secure the position for former President Trump or win the position for new President Biden. Now, if Biden wants to win the elections in 3 more years, he has to secure a large enough people that's going to support his candidacy. In democracy, this is relatively a large number of people. Now, in a non-democracy, the number of people that's gonna secure the leader's survival is much smaller. Like, let's keep the example again. So I talked a lot about the United States. Let's think about, this is the military elite junta which controlled Argentina in the latter half of the 20th century. And this is former Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein. For both of those types of regimes, the number of people that are needed for the leader to secure his position is much smaller. So for Saddam, for example, it was member of his own party, which most of them were actually members of his extended family. So as long as those people support Saddam Hussein as the leader of Iraq, he will be the leader of Iraq, regardless of what the public thinks. That's the difference between a large winning coalition in democratic countries such as the United States, the United Kingdom, France, any one of those countries, and non-democracies such as Iraq and other countries like that. All the leader has to do is to ensure the support of a small number of people in those kinds of countries in order to ensure that they will survive in office, right? So those are the two differences, and that's the logic behind selectorate theory. Now let's talk about that in the context of sanctions. So a leader which faces sanctions, whether it is a leader of a democracy or a non-democracy, the pool of resources that that leader has is smaller, right? Because sanctions lead to lower income for that country. That serve as a constraint on leader, which still their number one goal is to remain in office. But still, now they have smaller pool of resources to provide to their supporters, to their members of their winning coalition. If sanctions are placed on key supporters of the leaders, then they're more likely to be successful in either type of those regimes. Now let's talk about it more specifically first about democracy, and then I'll talk about it in the context of autocracies. So in democratic countries, sanctions can be more effective because the number of people is gonna needed for the leader to secure her survival is much bigger, because leaders cannot provide private benefits to secure their position. They just don't have enough money. Facing sanctions, they will have to accept the demand by the country which levies the sanctions. Otherwise, they face the risk of losing their supporters. That's exactly the logic behind sanction policy, that is creating economic costs on the public, and that's going to have political effects on the extent of support from members of that public on the leader. So the leader has incentive to alter its behavior, and that is what is called the deprivation effect. We're creating deprivation on members of society, and they're the ones who are supposed to support the leader. That creates incentive for the leader to change its behavior. That's one potential effect because of sanctions levied in a democratic countries. At the same time, when sanctions are placed and it takes and we're looking at it for a longer period of time, the public support may actually shift. Instead of the public supporting or opposing the actions of the government, which led to those sanctions, what happened is that the public support will shift and will be opposing the sanctions themselves. Thinking about it in the context, you can see this sign that you have here, that the sanctions are destroying our youth. We're thinking about it also from the context of some psychological mechanisms that I've mentioned a couple of weeks ago. The sanctions are placed upon our country by an external force. It harms our ability to develop more and to secure our economy and secure our future. So instead of opposing the government, which the actions of the government led to those sanctions being placed upon us, we are opposing the external action itself. We are opposing the sanctions. Now, this outcome fits to what's called the backlash effect. So the sanctions were placed, and instead it created the backlash. And it is based on the phenomenon which I've mentioned earlier, the rally around the flag effect. So everybody rallies around the flag. Everybody in the country have to rally around and support the government because we have an external threat, sanctions placed upon us. So overall, the outcome in this case is that the likelihood that the sanctions will be successful is a lot smaller in that case. So those are the two potential effects in democratic countries. Now, for autocrats, we have to understand first that the reward structures that for their supporters is much different. Again, they do not have to provide rewards to a lot of people because the winning coalition, reminding you again, the selectorate theory logic, for autocrats, the winning coalition is much smaller. Again, always think about the example of Iraq and Saddam Hussein. It's very simple. He only has to satisfy members of his own political party to ensure that he survives in office. Because dictators depend on this smaller coalition of supporters, they have a lot more power facing sanctions, and they have relatively larger control when it comes to that. And overall, even facing this kind of sanction policy, it's easier for them to protect their supporters from those kinds of economic costs. And again, the examples that we think about is Iraq, Argentina is another example. Now, when leaders of those kinds of countries are facing sanctions, then again, their number of resources is smaller. But what those leaders will do, that they will use whatever resources they have to themselves and just to their supporters, and will leave nothing for the population. So again, let's take a hypothetical example. Let's say that Saddam Hussein, the leader of Iraq, had $100 billion to provide around. He kept about 60 million for himself. He provided about 38 million to his supporters to ensure that he can survive in office, this small members of his own political party. And he left like 2 million in which he placed in some abstract public projects. So just to be seen globally that he does something for his population. Now, what happens if facing sanctions, instead of having this $100 billion, now he only has $50 billion. What he's going to do, he's going to use $30 billion to himself, and the remaining $20 billion will only go to members of his winning coalition to ensure he survives in office, which again leaves the public with nothing. Other actions that those kinds of leaders are more likely to do is to create black markets, to promote or encourage the creation of black markets and systems of corruption, which will generate more revenue to the government, despite facing sanctions. It's going to make the government even stronger in that sense. The result overall is that sanctions that are placed over a long period of time is actually good for those kinds of leaders of autocratic countries. They're not that much concerned about that because they're able to generate enough income for themselves, and they're also getting stronger internally and externally. And overall, the ones that suffer the most are members of the public, as always. Now, also in terms of failure, when is failure more likely against democracy? So overall, democracies are more sensitive, as I said, to the pressure from economic sanctions, right? Because the public is affected by those sanctions. So the public is supposed to put pressure on the government to change its behavior. However, if the public resists, so that when I talked about the backlash effect, and this resistance to the sanctions is also evident within the media, the opposition, and there's larger, because in democratic countries, there's larger transparency. So when somebody resists the sanctions, it's a lot easier to share that information, right? Now, if there is a kind of a united front against sanctions by the government, by the opposition within the political system, by members of the media, and by the public, all that means that it's a signal for the countries which places the sanctions on this democracy that for all members of the country, the target country, the cost of conceding to the sanctions is too high, and it's not likely that the country will concede. So it's more likely that the sanctions will fail. That's the idea behind that. And that's one of the benefits that democracies have in fighting against sanctions. All right, let's go and talk a little bit about a couple of studies that applied the logic of sanctions and tested them in different contexts. First is the study by Ellen. She began by presenting the logic of sanctions and then tested the potential conditions for success and failures. Her focus was both on the policy aspects of the sanctions as well as different domestic conditions. So what are some of her more interesting findings on her research? So, for example, one thing she found was that comprehensive sanctions are more likely to be successful. So sanctions should cover both imports as well as exports, as well as financial transactions of countries. That makes it a lot more likely to be successful. When the action of placing the sanctions is a multilateral action, multiple countries trying to enact this kind of policy, it's less likely to be successful, mostly because of issues of cooperation. So we can think about the example of the sanctions on Iran, which were part of the cooperation between members of the EU as well as the United States, and how hard it was to sustain that cooperation over a long period of time. She still found regimes to be critical and democracies more likely to be sensitive to that, more likely to concede than dictatorships, which fits with the theoretical argument which I mentioned earlier. Also similar to some of the things that I've mentioned earlier, prolonged sanctions against democracies are not likely to be successful. As an example, she talked about sanctions placed by Spain on England with regard to the English control over the Gibraltar area. Now, those sanctions were placed somewhere around 1954. They were in place for over 30 years, and they did not lead to any substantial outcome. So this is just one example. And finally, she found that turnover, in the sense of leadership change, when this takes place in the sender state, so the country that places the sanction, that it increases the odds that the sanctions will fail, because the new leader, the new president, the new prime minister may not view that specific policy aspect as that important and may change the aspect. So that's one research which directly tests those kinds of, a lot of those arguments that I've talked earlier about the domestic institutions. How does it matter regime type and different elements within regimes, whether the sanction policy is more likely to be successful or not. Now, I want to talk about another research which explores some of the mechanisms of economic sanctions, primarily testing how do citizens in the state targeted by sanctions view these kinds of measures. Is the logic of the theory of economic sanctions work? Does placing sanctions on a country actually affect the public in a way that the theory predicts and lead to the change in behavior? So I want to talk about this research by Grossman and his associates. They focused on a democratic state, Israel, and how its citizens view different sanctions that were levied by the European Union, economic sanctions. Their focus in this case is on what's called a smart sanctions design, which is sanctions which are focusing on the beneficiaries of a specific policy which the sender opposes. So the EU in that case opposes a specific policy by the Israeli government, and the sanctions were focusing on the beneficiaries from that policy. At the same time, that kind of design is also intended to minimize the devastating consequences for the entire population. This study is mostly focusing on measuring public attitudes and does an analysis in order to explore the public opinion regarding the political consequences of sanctions. So the author used two types of empirical tests. First, they are using survey data collected in Israel following the 2015 decisions by the European Union to label products from the West Bank and the Golan Heights. So what you have here is an example for products that were manufactured in the West Bank. And as you can see here, there's a label that says West Bank Israeli settlements produce. So that was the type of action taken at the time. This is a type of sanctions which is intended to target specific aspect of the policy. In this case, the attempts by the Israeli government to entrench its control over the territories and the Golan Heights. And it potentially can have also wider implications for harming trade relations between Israel and the European Union. But again, the focus is mostly on all kinds of manufactured products, whether they are in the West Bank or the Golan Heights. So that was the focus of the policy. the main benefits of using these kinds of tests, using surveys in Israel, is that it relates to a real world event, which is very salient for members of the population. Therefore, the measures you're gonna collect are more likely to reflect actual attitudes by the public. At the same time, the cost for this kind of test is it's going to be much harder to generalize the results because this is a very targeted and limited types of sanctions, and it is employed by a very specific standard, the European Union. So in terms of generalizing from this specific research, we have some downside, but it has the benefits of actually measuring the public attitudes, not just giving an hypothetical example, which is much harder to assess whether attitudes are the real attitudes. The second test that they run is a lab experiment in which they manipulate or they alter some of the factors. So for example, they talk about different types of sanctions, whether it is a material sanction or a symbolic sanctions, whether it is a targeted policy such as the EU policy or a more comprehensive type of sanctions. So for example, academic boycott is a targeted type of sanctions, but it's non-material. When you're focusing on all Israeli goods, it's both comprehensive and material. This is just examples for the type of sanctions. They also focused on the identity of the sender, whether it is a unilateral or a multilateral action, and whether the sender is a supportive types of actor, such as sanctions placed by the United States, or a critical type, for example, sanctions levied by members of the European Union. So let's look at some of their results. What we see here is different types of policies and how the imposition of sanctions affected the public opinion in this case. What we have to focus on, these are all those markers represent the different effects. As you can see, many of them are on the minus, on the negative side of the scale, which means a negative effect. And what we have to focus on is on those markers that, again, do not cross the zero value. Because if they cross the zero value, that means it represents there's no statistical significance, the effect may be zero. And what you have here in the different colors are different segments within the sample. The red marker represents the full sample of respondents, and the different colors here, the blue, green, and purple, represent respondents which are right-wing partisans, center partisans, or left-wing. So overall, what we see is actually evidence for the backlash effect. In wherever we have a significant effect, there is greater oppositions for different policy actions that the EU was trying to get the Israeli government to engage in. So for example, for resuming negotiations with the Palestinian Authority, as you can see, the sanctions actually had a negative effect, whether it is overall across the entire populations, other members within the right-wing supporters or the central supporters, all of them had different levels of negative effect on supporting this kind of policy. So the sanctions did not help there. Similarly, when it comes to support the policy of freezing the settlements, a negative effect across the entire population and the entire sample in this case, and among many of the support of the voters of the center parties. So again, a backlash effect for the placement of sanctions and those kinds of policy. Also, we have here the extent of support for the prime minister, and we see that there is some drop in support for the prime minister. However, when they ran some more of their analysis, they found that this negative effect on support for the government was not because the public was critical of the government not accepting the demands by the European Union, but exactly the opposite. The public had a desire for the government to adopt an even more hawkish policy facing those kinds of sanctions. So this is why there was criticism on the government, not you have to change your policy and accept the demands by the European Union. No, you have to adopt actually a more extreme policy in this case because they place sanction on us. So this is a lot of evidence for in-group solidarity and some of those internal mechanisms which I've mentioned earlier. This is another set of results focusing on different types of sanctions. So it's what you have here on the x-axis. It's pretty small, and sorry about that, and the sender itself. And again, broken down by the partisanship. This is the full sample, right wing, center, and left wing. Once again, in this figure, just like the previous figures, we have to focus on those markers that do not cross the zero line. So for example, among left-wing voters, when the quartet, which is some members of the European Union, place the sanctions on all Israeli goods, it actually has a positive effect on pressuring the government to change its policy. Now, when it comes to central voters, and when the sanctions are placed by the United States, there's a positive effect here. Here it's similarly whether the sender is the United States or the quartet, and what are the specific types of sanctions that were placed. We have here academic boycott, Israeli goods overall, visa restrictions. So again, overall, what we see here, there's not a lot of evidence that those sanctions had the effect that the EU was expecting it to do, or overall in the lab experiment, whether the sender state was able to accomplish and to be successful in this case. Okay, so if we're looking at the entire sample here, we see that when the United States, which is again is an ally of Israel, places sanctions on all Israeli goods, then actually it might be effective. But in most other cases, it would not. So one of the important implications of this research is that it casts serious doubt about the utility of either symbolic or limited types of sanctions, and overall, whether even comprehensive sanctions are more likely to be successful over the long run. All right, now we'll shift to talk about the other type of economic policy tool that is being used by government, and that's foreign aid. So foreign aid is the contribution of money, goods, and services to other governments, other people, or other communities in foreign countries. The aid is viewed as given for free, but it's usually given as a highly subsidized loans or for a price which is well below the market value. Foreign aid is primarily given by foreign governments, NGOs, which are non-governmental organizations such as the Red Cross, and various types of charities. So this is foreign aid overall. The main objective behind these types of policy action is to create this trade-off. That is, the recipient country, the country that receives the foreign aid, must offer some policy concession in exchange to getting these funds. In turn, once the recipient country gets the funds because it accepted the change in policy, it can distribute the transfers from the aid to her resource base. However, one of the complicating factors in this case is that the leaders, both in the recipient country as well as the sender country, whether it is the United States providing foreign aid to Somalia, the leaders in both of those countries are subject to political pressure and political competition for their position. And that makes this whole issue a lot more complicated, and I'll get to that in a few minutes. Overall, most evidence suggests that aid programs have failed in most of their objectives in terms of alleviating poverty, promote economic, social, and political equality, as well as spreading freedom and justice. So those are very general and very large goals, but in most cases, there's not much evidence that aid programs have been able to do that. In many cases, aid is given to dictators who, instead of providing that to the people who need that, tends to steal most of the money and do very little to advance the well-being of their citizens. Now, one of the important elements that is added to that discussion is that aid, when it's given, it's hardly ever provided just for humanitarian purposes. In many cases, it has larger objectives, including the spread of some kind of an ideology or an indirect expansion of trade with the recipient country, or in some cases, even securing the existing leaders in office. So again, let's take as an example, the United States providing aid to Somalia. The objectives that the United States has in providing this aid is not just humanitarian purposes, some of it, but not all of it. It could be to put pressure on Somalia to accept some kind of ideology or reject some kind of ideology. It's whether to lead to stronger trade relations between the United States and Somalia after providing this kind of aid, or because the United States is happy with the current leader of Somalia, so they will provide aid so that leader can survive in office. That can be some of the motivations in this case. What I want to think about is the links between receiving foreign aid and the domestic institutions or domestic effects of it within the country, within the recipient country. So we're going to talk about how is aid allocation directly related to the leader's desire to secure her survival instead of improving the conditions of the population. And by design, this kind of view of foreign aid, which is very prevalent in research, sets an important restrictions on the normative angle of why to provide aid. Okay, so if we want to think about it in that context, we can again use selectorate theory, which I've presented earlier today. One of the central models that explain the political economy of foreign aid relies on selectorate theory in order to explain the motivations of both sides to engage in these kinds of policy. A quick reminder again on selectorate theory, the idea is that leaders want to survive in office, so they have to secure the support of certain segment within the population, what's called the winning coalition. Reminding you again, for democracies, the winning coalition is a lot bigger than non-democracies, because in democracy, the leader has to secure a large enough citizens to support the leader in order to win the elections. On the other hand, in non-democracies, the dictator or the autocrat only has to secure the leader of a small number of people, such as member of her own party or members of the military elites, in order to secure their survival. So that's a quick reminder about selectorate theory and the winning coalition. Now, how that relates to the context of foreign aid. When leaders receive aid, they will usually use that additional income and distribute that to members of their coalition in exchange for those coalitions accepting the fact that the country will adopt a policy that maybe some members of that coalition will dislike. So for example, if the foreign aid is given in exchange for changing the support from sending military forces by that country to another country, and now I will not send the forces to that country because I receive foreign aid, then I will distribute that aid to members of my coalition in order for them not to overly object to the fact that I'm no longer sending my military to another country in Africa, Asia, Europe, whatever that may be. Now, let's talk about it more in the context of non-democratic countries, because, as I said, most of aid is provided to these countries. When leaders of small coalitions, such as dictatorships or monarchies, do, is that they will distribute the vast majority of these extra resources to their coalition, and again, leaving the vast majority of the citizens without it. And the logic of foreign aid is very similar to sanctions, only this time, the pool of resources, instead of getting smaller because of sanctions, it actually gets larger because of foreign aid. However, the public will still not get any of the benefits, because what the leader is going to do, what the dictator is going to do, is going to use these extra funds in order to provide them to her winning coalition, the small number of people that will going to secure that leader in office, so they will not be overly criticizing the fact that the leader, the dictator, accepted a change in policy that they do not like necessarily. So the public in this case faces two types of losses. The first is they have to face the ramification of a change in policy that they dislike. Maybe they accepted the existing policy and now the policy changes because of the foreign aid, but the public sees nothing out of it. So they have to accept this fact. At the same time, they get no material compensation for the fact that the policy is being changed and they cannot do anything about it. So the public has a double, the loss for the public in this case is twofold. Now, this effects on the public has implication for how the donor state is viewed by members of the population. So again, let's go back to our hypothetical example of the United States providing foreign aid to Somalia. So what I'm talking now is the way that the citizens in Somalia view the United States. In many cases, what happens is that the citizens in the recipient states, in our example, this is Somalia, will have a negative view on the United States, the country that provided the foreign aid, because in their minds, the United States provided aid to a corrupt regime and only helped that regime survive. So the citizens in Somalia are mostly suffering from the behavior of their own government, and they view their own government as corrupt and one that needs to be replaced. But instead of the United States putting anything in order to replace that government, the United States only gives them aid and helps them survive even more. So the view of the United States in the eyes of this public is very, very negative. In addition, we need to think about it also in the context of the public of the donor state. So again, let's go back in our example, the American public. What is the benefits for member of the American public by providing foreign aid to Somalia? If we take this example a few decades back to the Cold War, maybe the United States provide foreign aid to Somalia, so Somalia will resist or reject communism. How does that affect or helps the average John Smith that lives in College Station, Texas? It's not clear at all. Another example, a more real-world example, instead of our hypothetical example, is the relationship between the United States and Egypt. Since Egypt signed the Camp David Accord and the peace agreements with Israel in the late 1970s, the United States has provided an extended amount of aid to Egypt, And one of the central motivations to that was to provide incentives for the Egyptian government to maintain recognition of Israel and stick with a peace agreement, essentially. The problem for that, when you're thinking about it in the context of the Egyptian public, it's not especially popular among most Egyptian citizens and the policy itself. And the government is not making any efforts to use this additional funds in order to increase public investments in programs which are going to improve the public perception of the peace agreement. For example, investing more in public education will make public members more educated, having more information about the benefits of the peace agreement with Israel, and therefore their rejection or their opposition to this kind of agreement will be smaller. But the government does not do anything like that. Instead, this aid mostly is intended to help the survival of the Egyptian leaders and does very little to the population. It increases the odds that those in power, so for current president and former President Assisi, he will remain in power, and they will keep pursuing policies that's going to ensure their own survival using this kind of aid and offer very little to the population. So this is part of the problems, and this is a real-world example for those kinds of issues. Last thing I'm going to talk about is an application of a research that applies the idea of a foreign aid policy and how that affects conflict-related issues. This is the work by Sexton from a couple of years ago. Now, in this research, the author employs the logic of foreign aid as a policy tool in civil war. And the foreign aid in this case is intended to strengthen the government, allow it to establish control over contested territories, and win public support. So essentially, on the long term, it's supposed to help to end the civil war. Now, one of the important questions that the author raises in this context is, how does the provision of aid have what type of an effect the provision of aid has on the potential increases in violence? And how is that? The logic that the author offers is to think about the strategic calculation of participants in a civil conflict and how they can derail the potential benefits of aid. The focus in this case will be on the rebels, on the insurgents in a civil war. And their strategic view is to respond to the distribution of aid to the government in a way that's going to mitigate the potential benefits from aid in making the government stronger. The primary motivation in this case for them will be to act in response to the distribution of aid and prevent those kinds of action from undermining their own position in the conflict. Now, this dynamic is mostly prevalent in contested territories. So this is territories within the country where the government does not have full control and the rebels do not have full control. So this is territories which are mostly in question. And the rebels will resist through the execution of violent actions, of course. And those violent actions are intended to call into question the utility of aid that is intended to help the counterinsurgency efforts by the government. So the idea is that rebels will engage in more aggressive actions in those contested areas and lead some people to question whether this aid actually is helpful, because aid is supposed to help the government to fight the rebels, but there is even more conflict in those areas. So why is the aid even helpful? The author uses Afghanistan as a test case. He focuses on the geolocation of violent incidents between 2008 and 2010, and the author mostly differentiates between areas under U.S. military control, which is actually where the Afghan government controls with the help of the United States military forces, to where they do not control and rebels have control, or these are contested areas. And this variation in those areas is critical because it helps us to establish the causal effects of the civilian aid programs. How is that helpful in the fight against the Taliban in the context of Afghanistan? Sorry about that. Before we go into the final parts of today, I'll start for today's attendance word. This is the word Aggies. We'll use the word Aggies as Texas A&M Aggies for today. That's attendance word for today. So some of the main findings of this research. First, the author finds that aid, which is distributed to contested areas, actually lead to significant increases in the insurgent violence. So as we speculated in this case, when I talked about it a couple of minutes ago, the distribution of aid leads the rebels to increase their extent of violence. Another finding is that aid was helpful in reducing violence in areas that were already under control by the Afghan government and with the support of the United States. So areas which were already under control of the Afghan government, when they received aid, then it led to further decrease in the extent of violence. And third is that the type of aid program matters. Humanitarian projects will be ineffective in this case, while defense project increases the extent of violence in both contested areas as well as government-controlled areas. So defense types of project tended to increase the amount of violence. Some of the implications of that research is first that aid cannot by itself win the support of the public. It can only serve as a force protection and a pacifying tools in areas where the government has already established its control. So it can only help in areas which are already under the political control of the government. It cannot lead to a complete change in the political outcomes. And second is that the aid provide incentives for escalation in the attacks, mostly by the insurgents and not by the government. So this is on some level maybe useful in alleviate some of the effects of civil war, but not necessarily so. If you want to read a little bit more, then of course we have all kinds of additional current research, very, very current research. If you're interested in that, you are more than welcome to go to those studies and read more. If you have any questions, of course, office hours, email, talk to me. I can help you if you need. One more reminder, next Friday is your deadline to submit the midterm task. With that, I am done for today, and I will see you if you are going to be on our Friday meeting. Then I will see you then. Bye, everyone.